how did this turn out to be such a surprising American presidency when it comes to national security? You know, you'll remember it was only 4 years ago that you had, in the midst of a presidential campaign, people on the left thinking that President Obama was the complete anti-war candidate because they weren't listening carefully to how he distinguished between Iraq and Afghanistan. They weren't listening when he said what he would be doing in Pakistan if he ever found bin Laden, and so forth. And you had people on the right who were using the phrase community organizer as a way of saying this is not somebody who has any experience in national security, which he had very little in, and were seeming to suggest was not ready to be commander-in-chief. So what happens? Both of these groups end up being surprised, Jane. You know, the left is saying, did we sign up for somebody who uses drone strikes every few days or weeks? And the right is saying, gee, this isn't the guy we thought we had. And the book is an effort to try to explain how he got from where he was in the campaign to what we're seeing today.
Well, take us to that moment when he first came in as president and George Bush took him aside and urged him to hang on to two classified programs.
Yeah. So about 3 or 4 days before the 2009 inauguration, there was a meeting where President-elect Obama comes over to see President Bush, and it's just the two of them. This is a pretty traditional thing, happens during most changes in power. But in the course of that conversation, he said, there are two programs that you're not going to want to do without, even though you may initially have your doubts about them. And one is drones, and he described its import over Pakistan. This is before we were using them in Yemen and so forth. And the other was a remarkable secret program called Olympic Games, which had begun in the Bush administration and was, to President Bush's mind, the best chance that the United States and Israel had of avoiding war with Iran, or at least avoiding an Israeli strike on Iran, if it was successful. But it was at a very, very nascent stage. And it's actually hinted at in the first pages of The Inheritance, which came out 2 weeks before this meeting took place, and I described that President Bush had authorized computer attacks. But we didn't know very much about what those were going to look like, and certainly didn't know the level of detail that we do now.
So let's talk a little bit about what are the implications for our security over time of using cyber attacks. Because obviously we have a big advantage in terms of the capacity to attack those systems that undergird not just military facilities, but civilian life. But we're also the most information-dependent country in the world, or one of them. What is our vulnerability going forward, and how have we thought about that at the same time that we're launching offensive strikes?
Well, as you delve into this account in Confront and Conceal, and by the way, Confront and Conceal is not just about infrastructure strikes against Iran. It's a book about Afghanistan and Pakistan and China and the Arab Spring and so forth. But this is a very central part of the light footprint strategy that the president's put together. The core question that President Obama kept asking as he got briefed up on this program was, what precedent does it set if the United States is the first nation that ends up making sustained use of cyber weapons? And this has been sustained. I wasn't able to figure out how many strikes there were against Iran, but they started in the Bush administration, they accelerated in the Obama administration. So there have been many, many, and it took the Iranians until, I think, 2010 before they really figured out what was going on. And that was a fascinating story. It's actually the story the book begins with, and we'll get to it in a moment. But there was discussion about whether or not this sets a precedent and how vulnerable we are. And it was an important discussion because Olympic Games and Stuxnet, which is what escaped from Natanz and got named as the virus in the summer of 2010, and that's the moment the Iranians realized what was happening to them, was itself a very different kind of computer attack than what we're all used to. almost all cyber attacks until now have been computer to computer. I have my laptop, go into your laptop, Jane, read those fascinating emails, clear out your bank account, whatever, and that's
what
the
went wrong.
That's what happened. Okay, this was different. This was an effort to go through Iranian computers in order to get at the centrifuges in the underground site at Natanz, and to destroy them without bombing them from above, and without sending in a bunch of agents, sort of OSS style, as the way they did it in World War II, to blow them up on the ground. And it played off of an incredible vulnerability that the Iranians had. The Iranians had bought their centrifuges, or the initial ones before they started building them, from A.Q. Khan, who was the Pakistani rogue nuclear scientist. And these centrifuges, which the Pakistanis called P1s and immediately discarded because they are the Ford Pintos of the, there are probably people in this audience who are too young to remember Ford Pintos, but just imagine a car that would self-immolate, okay? So these would break down very frequently. And the insight, the sort of central insight that the US and Israel had in 2007, 2008, was that if they could get into the system and speed these centrifuges up, remember they're spinning at supersonic speeds, or slow them down very dramatically, they could destabilize them. And a destabilized centrifuge explodes and probably takes out all the centrifuges next to it, and takes out anybody who's standing next to it too, okay? So the trick was, could they get inside these computer systems? And the difficulty is that Iran, recognizing that, of course, that Natanz is a big target for the West, did what most American companies do, which is they created what they call an air gap, sort of an electronic moat around the whole facility. So it wasn't connected to the internet. So it's not as if you could dial into these computers. So somebody had to walk in the worm. And so the way the process began was that in the late Bush administration years, the first thing they did was send in what's called a beacon, which was essentially a program to make a blueprint of how the computer system in Natanz was connected to these thousands of centrifuges. And then the beacon had to phone home. It's kind of the ET of computer worms, okay? And send back that plan. Once they had that, the United States and the Israelis built basically a mock-up of the entire Natanz enrichment plant. They spread this out over several Energy Department laboratories so that even inside the Energy Department, people didn't have an idea of what they were doing. But they did it at several of these facilities. And then they designed a worm to see if they could do what is delicately called destructive testing. And when it succeeded, they took the rubble of these P1 centrifuges and flew it back to Washington and dumped it on the conference room table in the sit room and brought President Bush down to see it. And it was at that moment that they then approved this to go on in a larger way. And they designed several versions of this, started in small ways, varied it each time. And for the first few years, the Iranians weren't quite sure what was going on. They thought that maybe they just had bad P1s. We know how unreliable these are because when Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons program, something he probably regretted last year that he had done, the United States got the centrifuges that had been in Libya, and they're the same kind that were going to Iran. So they had a whole group to test. And so as these started to blow up, the Iranians couldn't figure out what was going wrong. They actually fired people because they thought they were making technical errors. And it wasn't until the Stuxnet mistake that they figured out that they were under attack.